Hi, this is Andre. I want to take a look at some of my latest findings for doing post-performance production and mixing on a solo live looping performance. Thanks very much to Nakarin Teerapeenun for commissioning this one. So when I put out recordings of solo looping stuff, I don't just take the recording and then upload the unadulterated file just as it was tracked and call it a day. There are a lot of things that I like doing to it after the fact as far as mixing the audio, doing different types of treatments and processing to the audio. So it's really about trying to take the live performance and honor the performance and present it in the best possible light using a lot of different techniques and approaches in audio production. We've talked about this in some previous videos. For this particular video, we're going to look at a release I just put out. This is at the end of February 2019 in the 6-string mixtape series, which is designed to document live in-studio live looping jams that I do here. This is the third installment in the series, and this is a little different from anything I've done before, both in terms of the performance itself and in terms of how I've kind of dealt with the performance after the fact. So let's talk about the performance first off. It's a 35-minute continuous jam. This is the original performance here, and this bit here at about 118 is when I started fading in. And the reason I faded that in at 118 rather than start from the very beginning is just because it took a little while to get going. It took a little while for me to warm up on the performance. And honestly, my experience has been that when I have music online that people can listen to, most people do not listen past the first few seconds. And that's not anything that's unique to me. I've noticed that that's the case for pretty much every musician I've heard of or talked to about this. If you look at the playback statistics on Bandcamp or YouTube or CD Baby or MP3.com or SoundCloud, going all the way back 20 plus years, statistically speaking, people just don't tend to listen past the first few seconds. And with that in mind, and knowing that I'm deliberately putting this out publicly, which means that on a certain level I'm looking for a certain amount of public attention, my inclination is to try and present it in the best possible light. And part of that for me, in the way I'm choosing to do this right now, is make sure that it's as compelling as possible right from the get-go. One of the reasons that I decided to release this entire 35-minute jam is because to me it holds up unusually well for something like that. It's relatively easy to record long noodly improvs with live looping stuff. For me personally, just speaking as an artist, it's relatively tricky to actually get something that really maintains interest and holds up and can be listened to top to bottom as a cohesive experience. And this was one of those cases, and I happened to be recording when I did it, so that's why I'm putting it out. And like I say, there's nothing terrible about these about the first minute and 20 seconds, but I didn't really feel that it started really kicking in until about here, about 1 minute 16, and that's why I did a fade in. And I did a fade in rather than a hard cut, just because I wanted it to be clear that this was something in progress. So if you listen here, you can hear that it gradually fades in. And it would probably be just as obvious if I did a hard cut, but a fade in seemed like the best way to get that taken care of. So dealing with this has led me to take a few different approaches as far as the actual engineering and the audio side of it, as far as mixing and mastering it. I guess I'll talk about one of the plugins here. I did do a lot of dynamic EQ. So I'm going to open up the Tokyo Dawn Records Nova plugin. This is a free plugin, by the way, and it's great. And what I'm doing here is a dynamic EQ. And what that means is that it will attenuate different frequencies depending on how loud those frequencies get. So I'm just going to play a little bit of the track, and we can look at the display of Nova. So you can see as it's playing, all of these bands are actually moving. And that's all 4 of these frequency bands dynamically responding to how loud the input signal is at any given time. So the idea of a dynamic EQ is that if there's a lot of content in a certain frequency area, then it will kick in and do more of a cut in that area. And if there's not that much content in a frequency range, then it doesn't touch it. And everything I did here was a cut. And these were all areas that at various points I found could potentially get a little out of control or a little unruly or a little squirrely. So the idea of the dynamic EQ is that it just kind of reins in those frequencies when they get problematically loud. And if they don't get loud, then those frequencies don't get touched that much. So I'm going to bypass all of the bands. I'm going to bypass the entire Nova EQ, and you can hear how it changes. So the biggest difference is that when you bypass the Nova EQ, you hear a lot more high frequencies, high mid-range frequencies. And that's really where a solid body electric guitar lives. That's really where a lot of the frequencies coming out of the instrument are gonna be coming from. What I choose to do in situations like this, and what I did choose to do for this particular recording, is try and scale those back and try and cut them back a little bit so that it wasn't so mid-range heavy, and so that you could listen to it at a reasonably loud volume and not have some of those high frequencies really kind of be cutting. Let me find an area where I'm doing more of the snare type percussive hits. Yeah, so I'm going to cut the Nova in and out around there, and you can hear the difference as far as how those higher mid frequencies cut through. So with Nova engaged, it's a much more kind of even frequency spectrum. I don't feel like any particular frequencies are really jumping out. When we disengage it, a lot of the high mids are really leaping forward, which again, you would expect from an electric guitar. And if I was mixing guitars for like a straight ahead rock or pop track, that's exactly what we would probably want, because that's how the guitar fits into those kinds of arrangements. But for something like this, where the solo guitar is supposed to be the entire sound, I like to try and even out the sound more and kind of fill in some of the different frequency gaps. Part of that comes from cutting frequencies that are really loud, and part of that comes from doing subtle things to boost some of the other frequencies that aren't so prominent in a regular guitar signal. I'm just going to jump around to a few other spots within the performance, and we'll A/B what it sounds like both with and without the Nova EQ. Yeah, especially on that last example. When we cut the Nova EQ out, a lot of those higher frequencies and a lot of those percussive hits start getting a little harsh and a little kind of painful to listen to for me. And in general, for more energetic stuff, my litmus test for mixing is that I want to be able to listen to the stuff reasonably loudly, not deafeningly loudly, but reasonably loudly, and not have the frequencies feel like they're piercing me. You know, I like something that is reasonably warm and that has a lot of impact, but isn't too harsh. And it's a trade-off, because a lot of those frequencies that are the most harsh, you know, the kind of danger zone around like the 1 to 5K, those are also the frequencies that solid body electric guitars tend to emanate the most. So it's a bit of a trade-off, but I definitely found that using the Nova helps kind of rein in those frequencies and make the overall picture a little more coherent. Let's go back to the individual channel and let's check out a couple of things going on. Aura. The first one on the mono channel is an Airwindows plugin, and this does very esoteric things as far as presence and high frequency type things. I've talked before about how Airwindows, which is basically Chris Johnson, Chris is like a mad scientist. He's like James Bond villain hiding their secret base in an active volcano grade mad scientist. He's a brilliant guy, and he does some really, really unusual stuff. So I'm not going to pretend that I understand exactly what something like Aura does. I'm just going to shut up and let us listen to the difference with and without it. So it really brings out a lot more high-end presence. And if I open up the plugin, there's basically just one control for voicing, and there's a wet-dry control. And as you can see, it's like 25% of the entire range. So this is not like a really huge amount of the effect, and it's also not super beat you over the head obvious, but as I engage it in and out, to me it's really apparent that you start getting a lot more kind of presence and definition if it's in. I'm going to do it a little more. After Aura in the channel, we have True Iron by a developer called Kazrog. And True Iron is basically a transformer simulation, which doesn't have anything to do with Autobots or Decepticons. Transformers are just components in hardware audio electronics. And here again, I'm not going to act like I know exactly what it's doing, because I don't. But I am going to A/B back and forth so we can compare the difference both with and without True Iron. That's a pretty subtle difference, and a lot of the effects that I used in this production are going to be pretty subtle in the impact. If you look at a lot of classic recordings, especially if you look at a lot of classic analog era recordings, the overall sound of those recordings doesn't necessarily come from just one thing. It doesn't necessarily come just from the analog tape that the multi-track stuff was put onto. It doesn't come just from the preamps that signals ran through. It doesn't come just from the microphones or the outboard processing or the mixing console. It rarely comes from any one of those things. A lot of it comes from all that stuff in tandem. You know, a lot of it is the sum of the parts kind of being greater than the individual components. So as we go through some of these other effects and we A/B them, in a lot of cases it's going to be a pretty subtle thing. And that's not to say that you can't get a good sounding result just by taking one or two things and kind of doing more of a brute force approach. But for my part, I've found that a little can go a long way. And the most satisfactory results I've tended to get have been from using a number of plugins in series, a number of effects in series, where each individual one is not necessarily doing a huge night and day change, but when you put them all together, it definitely changes the overall picture. So that's True Iron and Aura. Before we get to the master channel, let's look at these three bus sends. These are basically where I'm taking the mono EDP performance and I'm sending it to three auxiliary channels. So the first bus send is Valhalla Room. And I'm actually going to talk about the first two bus sends because this is the first time I've done this particular thing, which is use two different stereoization plugins at the same time. Now, one thing I do a lot of is stereoizing the EDP after the fact, and since I've been doing the Patreon-sponsored videos, the main plugin I've been using is the iZotope Ozone Imager, which sounds great, and it's a free plugin, and it can synthesize stereo from a mono signal, but it doesn't really change the sense of spatiality. So I'm just going to turn off the Valhalla Room, and I'm going to turn off the Renaissance Bass. We're just going to hear it with the Ozone Imager. So you can hear kicking in the Ozone Imager. It basically creates stereo from mono, but it doesn't really change the sense of space. What I'm going to do now is turn off the send for the Ozone Imager and turn on the send for Valhalla Room, which is a reverb plugin. And Valhalla Room is specifically designed largely to emulate real spaces. You know, it's not so much about getting the huge cavernous, like galaxy-spanning black hole type reverbs, although it can do some really cool, really big effects. But a lot of it is designed to really do very, very detailed, very in-depth kind of early reflection type things, which is what I'm using here. So let me play it both with and without Valhalla Room. So Valhalla Room is giving it some stereo imaging, but it's also giving it a bit of depth and space that you don't get from the Ozone Imager. So I'm going to isolate both of those stereoization plugins by themselves, and then we'll hear what they sound like together. Bus 1 is Valhalla Room, Bus 2 is Ozone Imager. So I haven't really tried this before. I've done a lot of different types of things to generate stereo image from a mono performance, but I've never actually tried using two different imaging things at the same time. And I was really happy and really pleasantly surprised at how well this came out. The third bus is the Waves Renaissance bass, and this basically generates bass information where it doesn't exist. Again, I'm going to shut up and just demonstrate. So bus 3 is the Renaissance bass, and we'll hear what it sounds like with and without. And as you can hear, it really generates a tremendous amount of low frequency information. I'm just going to solo the Renaissance bass for a second so we can hear just that by itself. So that's bypassing the Renaissance bass, so this is just the signal that that auxiliary channel is getting before we apply the Renaissance bass, and then let's compare it with and without. And now unsoloing Renaissance bass so we can hear everything together. And now bringing Renaissance bass, bringing the entire bus send in and out. So that's really a huge difference, and a lot of what I try and do if I'm dealing with mixing and presenting a live looping performance is try and fill in the gaps as far as the frequency information. The guitar, and especially a solid body electric guitar, is a very mid-rangey instrument, and we've already talked a lot about trying to rein in some of those more spiky mid-range frequencies, and part of it is reining in the really obnoxious frequencies, and part of it is also trying to fill in the gaps and try and bolster the frequencies that the guitar doesn't produce so much. So that's what the Renaissance bass processor does by Waves. I got this for free as a Black Friday thing several years ago. There are a lot of different plugins that do this type of thing as far as like generating psychoacoustic trickery to make the ear think that there's more bass than is actually there, or that kind of thing. I haven't tried a lot of them, to be honest, just because the Waves one works really well and I already have it, so I just kind of work with what I know in that regard. So speaking of filling in gaps, let's actually look at the stereo output, because a lot of what's going on here is about doing that. So we talked about the Nova EQ. The next thing in line is Air, which is another Airwindows plugin, and this is specifically designed to bring in a lot of high frequency information. So here again, we're going to listen to it both with and without the Airwindows Air plugin. So it's a fairly subtle thing, but the way I would describe the difference is that when I remove that, it kind of feels like there's a blanket over the speakers. You know, it feels like the audio is a little more obscured and a little less defined. The next plugin in line is Reelbus, which is a bit of a guilty subject for me. This is an analog reel-to-reel tape deck emulation by a company called Tone Boosters. And this basically emulates a lot of the distortions and imperfections that happen when you record on analog tape. So let me play a little bit of this, and I'm going to engage and disengage Reelbus as we go. So you can hear that's a pretty dramatic change. The reason I call this a guilty thing is because there's part of me that thinks it's kind of insane to be in 2019 and using a digital audio workstation to emulate the sound of deficiencies in a tape deck from however many decades ago. So in a conceptual sense, it's kind of crazy, and I will be the first to acknowledge that. In a practical sense, I love the way it sounds. Putting philosophy aside, yeah, I dig the way it sounds. And a lot of the types of music that are references for me when I do this kind of thing, whether it's funk or hip-hop or what have you, that music is based in very large part on the sound of analog gear and the sound of analog imperfections. So as anyone who's checked out any of my videos knows, I like to talk and philosophize about this stuff to a very great extent. But I also think it's good to just set all that aside and say, hey, does it sound better with it in there? If it does, then go ahead and use it. So that's basically my attitude towards that. Speaking of emulations of analog gear shortcoming, this is another Airwindows plugin called ToVinyl 4. This is designed to emulate the frequency response and the audio effects of playing something off of vinyl. Here again, I'm going to play some stuff and then we will engage it in and out. So it's a pretty subtle effect, but it definitely changes, a bit of the presence element and also the stereo imaging. For a lot of recordings, bass tends to be centered in mono. There are not a lot of recordings, especially if you're talking about like dance music or stuff with a really strong bass. Generally speaking, a lot of the bass frequencies are going to be set in mono. And what ToVinyl has is an effect where you can dial out the bass frequencies just in the side and not so much in the center. So I'm going to adjust that a little bit. Right now it's at 28.7 hertz. And as I bring it up and down, listen to how the overall stereo image changes. And again, it's a very subtle thing, but I find that being able to have the bass a little more center focused really helps with the overall presentation. Satin is yet another analog tape deck emulation. This one is made by a company called Yuhi. Satin is very different from Reelbus. Reelbus is more about kind of bringing out grit and dirt and a lot of the obvious imperfections that we associate with tape. Satin is more about emulating a very kind of polished approach where everything is calibrated properly. And you can get some of the more destroyed sounds with Satin, but it's first and foremost really designed to imbue a lot of the subtleties that you would get with a nice, well-tuned tape deck. And a lot of those are pretty subtle. So here again, let me play a little bit and we will engage it and disengage it. So again, by itself, it's not a huge difference. And I was actually a little surprised that I ended up using Satin. I was going through and trying to get the sound where I wanted, and I didn't necessarily know exactly what it needed. I just knew that I wanted to beef things up a little bit more, and Satin ended up working. As you can see, the input is really cranked. And it doesn't sound super smashed or distorted if you listen to it. It just, it gives it a little more saturation and a little more glue, which I really like. After Satin, we have the TR5 bus compressor from IK Multimedia. And here again, let's just A-B it. One of the things I do with this in particular is I compress the mids and the sides differently. So the mid is basically just the middle signal. The side signal is more of the far-reaching left and right stereo image. So what I'm going to do is just adjust the stereo image by itself. So this makeup level is just for the side image, just for stereo, and you'll hear how it changes the overall stereo picture of the whole thing. So a lot of what I like to do with this kind of thing is use it to kind of bring out more of the stereo image. And it is definitely possible to overdo the effect, so I don't like to get too crazy with it. But I really like that as far as like enhancing the stereo image, and also just bus compression in general is a good idea for a lot of types of music, this sort of thing included. After that, we have another edition of True Iron. And here again, there's nothing more or less scientific than I just liked how it sounded with it engaged at that point in the signal chain. After True Iron, we have another IK multimedia plugin, the 432 EQ. This is an emulation of a very high-end mastering EQ, and it basically does very subtle things. Some EQs are very obvious, and you can hear them and say, yeah, that's obviously really EQ'd. And this is not one of those. This is designed to be very kind of transparent. So here again, let's A-B it with the sound in and out. And a lot of what I'm doing with this, in fact, everything I'm doing with it, is high and low shelving, which is basically just bringing up the higher and lower far reaches of the sound and just boosting them. And again, a lot of this is just about trying to supplement the frequencies that are not particularly heavily filled by a regular electric guitar, and just trying to put a certain amount of polish on it. For a lot of this stuff, especially with high and low end frequencies and more mastering types of things, I find that these are not necessarily the sorts of things you notice when they are present, but when they're not there, you can tell that something is missing. You can tell that the recording doesn't sound as polished or presentable as it could. Obviously, what I'm doing here is pretty obscure stuff. This is pretty underground music, so it's not that I'm trying to get a bunch of bells and whistles and have it come across like a Kanye track or something like that, but I do want to try and present it in the best possible light. And for better or worse, our ears culturally are attenuated to hearing a certain amount of polish and a certain amount of production presentation. So I don't realistically think that my stuff is going to be competition with Jay Dilla or anybody like that, but I do like to use some of those recordings as references, just so I can try and get some of that subliminal high and low end stuff, just so that when people hear it, they don't necessarily listen to it and go, oh wow, listen to those high and low frequency boosts that Andre did. But neither do I want them to listen to it and feel like there's something really missing, like there's something conspicuously absent from the sound. And after that, we have Purest Gain, which is another Airwindows plugin. I basically use this as an overall level boost. And it's a pretty subtle boost, as you can see, less than a dB, just enough to goose the signal a little, get it into Spiral, yet another Airwindows plugin, which is kind of an analog style peak limiter kind of thing. Just designed to kind of be the last line of defense to make sure that things don't go over 0 dB, and also it adds a subtle but really nice layer of extra analog style saturation and warmth. Voxengo Span is basically a really nice frequency display. It's another free plugin, and it gives really nice readouts as far as frequency content, RMS information, peak levels, all that kind of thing. And finally, not just another Dither, which is yet another Airwindows plugin. Dither is a subject that is very arcane and mysterious to me, and some people get extremely worked up and passionate about different sides of the subject. I don't claim to be sensitive to that stuff. A lot of the time I have a hard time even hearing Dither, but long story short, Dither is something that is recommended as a very final stage for digital audio processing when you're rendering it for final delivery, and this is one that works. I've tried doing A/B comparisons of different types of Dither, and sometimes I can't hear a difference. Sometimes I'm convinced I can hear a difference, and then when I think I hear a difference, I actually compare and I realize that there is no actual difference between the files I'm comparing. So I believe that Dither exists. I believe it does a good thing. I don't claim to be an expert on it, so that's what I use. So this is a lot of stuff. This is definitely not a transparent presentation of solo live looping by any means. And I would say that unless you're talking about very obscure, rarefied audiophile high-end recordings, then we don't ever hear unadulterated recordings or performances. Even if you're just talking about listening to like an Adele tune with just Adele singing and playing acoustic piano. Both the piano and her voice are going through particular microphones that shape the sound in a certain way. They're going through preamps that shape the sound. They're going into mixing boards that also shape the sound. They're being given outboard processing. And when the stuff is finally mixed and mastered, those all are extra stages that imbue different types of sonic elements. I've said this before in one of my videos, but it reminds me of the old hairdresser line about how every hairstylist knows that it takes at least an hour to achieve the natural look. The sounds that we're used to hearing as regular, unadulterated, conventional sounds are actually the result of a lot of stuff going on. And that doesn't mean that everything is auto-tuned and quantized to death, but it does mean that we're used to hearing sounds that have gone through at least a certain amount of processing and equalization and compressing and preamping and that kind of thing. The best example I can give is that when you see footage of a movie or a TV show being shot, when you actually see footage of the production, you see these really bright lights, and I always see that stuff and I'm like, that seems so unnatural. I can't believe that they use all that stuff just to get it on TV. But that's what we're used to seeing. You know, what we associate with being a regular, conventional, presentable image on TV or cinema is based on doing a lot of stuff to it. And you don't necessarily watch that and think about all the color correction or lighting or editing or camera work or lens work or film types that went into that. But we definitely know that if we see something that was just recorded on a cheap camera or a raw iPhone camera phone or something, we can tell that something is not there. We can tell that something is missing. So that's what a lot of this boils down to for me. Just trying to present this stuff in the best way possible and try and make sure that the engineering aspect can really flatter and benefit the music and not be a deterrent or not detract from it. So this is where I'm at the end of February 2019 as far as my latest findings and experiments with various types of production and mixing and mastering and engineering things for presenting solo live looping performances. Thanks again very much to Nakarin Teerapeenun for commissioning this one, and thank you for tuning in as always. I will talk to you guys very soon. Bye-bye.